Okay, hello and welcome to Government. This is Chapter 1, Section 1. Remember, you can always pause and hit replay as you're taking notes. Also, remember, whatever you handwrite, you may use on your tests. So take lots of notes. If there's anything that doesn't make sense, you come in and we talk about it, and hopefully it makes more sense so that when it comes test time, you do really well. So let's start the semester off right. Okay, one of the things we need to understand is when we talk about countries, we sometimes use the word state, and they're the same thing. Now, we can't confuse California and that term of a state with what we're talking about here. So, for the purpose of this class, whenever you hear the word state, at least for this test, we need to be thinking about a country. Okay, so the important thing is these are people, they are part of a community, and there's a government on top of them. A state can make their own laws without anybody else having to approve it. And they have the power to make their own laws without any kind of approval. Okay, so they have boundaries, and usually these boundaries are, and the state is recognized by other states. Okay, so here we have a map of states. We have a brand new one right here, which was just created just a couple of years ago, right there. That's our new baby country called South Sudan, and again, there were a group of people that ethnically, religiously, culturally saw themselves as very different from the rest of Sudan. Northern Sudan tends to be a lot more Arabic. Southern Sudan tends to be more African in terms of culture and things like that. And so, because we have a war that lasted for quite a long time, and now we have a brand new country. And states can always change. Now, one of the things I want you to understand is there's something else out there called a nation. A nation, and Palestine, as you're seeing here, is an example of a nation. Palestine, it fits all of these categories. A large group of people, common heritage in terms of political, ethnic, religious, social, intellectual, artistic, all of those things culturally very similar. And they have been given a fair amount, and they have this history of self-rule. Okay, so at one point we had a Palestine prior to the establishment of Israel in 1948. The problem is that Israel controls all of this territory, including Palestine. Now, Israel has chosen to wall off a lot of these areas to make it more difficult for people to move between the areas of Palestine. They see it as a security measure because of the incredible amount of terrorism in the country. So theoretically, Palestinians are a nation within the state of Israel, but even Israel acknowledges that at some point there needs to be an actual recognition of Palestinian sovereignty and granting of independence. Hasn't happened yet. One of the difficulties is you have these three areas, which we call Palestine, and at some point there has to be a way to connect those lands so people can move. So that's going to probably require a significant amount of moving of both Palestinians as well as Israelites to make something like that happen. And we need to get rid of, there we go, we need to get rid of that. Another example is something out there called Kurdistan. This is not as well known. It's a group of people, same thing. They see themselves as their own nation, and they have a flag and an ethnic identity. And again, notice, this is actually Turkey. This is actually a foreign map. I need to update this. And then we have Syria. SYRA, right? And so you can see how the Kurdish people are scattered within multiple countries, so they do not have the ability to make their own laws. Now, the group that has the most sovereignty, meaning the most self-control, they're not totally independent, will be the Iraqi Kurds. They benefited from quite a long period where the United States aircraft patrolled this area and had a no-fly zone in northern Iraq, which allowed the Kurdish people a fair amount of freedom. And so to this day, the Kurdish people in Iraq have more say over their life than maybe Kurdish people in, say, Iran. Another example of this is the Kumai nation. We live within this area, and you recognize some of these if you look at. There's Viejas, Sequan, right? Barona. These are tribes of the Kumai nation. And notice how the territory extends into Mexico. So some of these tribes, they have similar language and culture and religion. There's connections there. Tribal groups tend to be autonomous, I mean they work on their own, but they do see themselves as a similar part of a similar group of people, and so they do not have sovereignty. Okay, so if you go into a reservation or tribal reservation, tribal territory, you're still within the United States and you're subject to all the rules and regulations of the United States, and the tribes are not allowed to make laws that conflict with U.S. Constitutional law and state constitutional law. So it's one of those things where they're underneath those governments. They're given a fair amount of freedom and say over their rules, but again, they cannot conflict with already established U.S. laws. Okay, so one of the questions is, how did we get what we have in terms of government? Where did government come from? The states. And one concept is that when we look at early societies prior to large societies with thousands of people, you had small tribal groups. And when we think of tribal groups, the theory is it's a family connection where the elders and the chief, those are essentially like grandpa and the other grandpas in the family, and through intermarriage, everybody's a cousin or an in-law because of that. And so that's tribal group, and there's no need for written laws and rules and regulations. The laws, though, everybody knows, they're explained. There's usually an oral history where a thing is passed down, but usually the elders have their word is law, and they have the power of life or death. So it's very similar to what we see in a tribal community today. The next concept is I have more tanks and bombs than you, and therefore, and this is what happens when a society gets big enough, and particularly large established societies where you have a king or somebody on top, and the idea is I have more power and I have a bigger army, and again, usually this is something that's constantly in flux because my might makes right, and if another group can build up a large enough military force, they can be in power. Another concept that arose a little later is the idea that the monarch or the person in charge was put there because of their connection to the gods, at least in a polytheistic society, or God if it's a monotheistic society. And the idea is that person has the right to rule, and their word is law as long as they're alive. And the idea is if the god or gods is not pleased with that person, they would be removed by the gods or gods themselves. And so the people have no rights. Notice in evolutionary theory, force theory, and divine right theory, the common person has little to no power. Okay. Again, moving closer to the modern era, we have something called the social contract theory, and Thomas Hobbes came out with the first concept of it, and then later we have John Locke sort of adds additional freedoms, and the idea is more and more people are given freedom. So the idea of social contract theory is that the leaders do have total power, and people cannot get whatever they want, but that power ultimately initially starts with the people. Now Thomas Hobbes says that, and then by sort of like an unwritten contract, the people give their power to the government in order to maintain order, because if you don't have order, you have chaos. So Thomas Hobbes said you can't break that contract. Now John Locke went one step further, and you can see he says that when the government doesn't do what what they're supposed to do. Either they're through neglect, not doing the things they need to be doing, or through commission, meaning doing bad things. Either way, it makes life difficult for the people who are ruled. So John Locke said that when government does bad or fails to do good, the people have the right to replace that ruler. And if you look at this, this is amazing. Would you sign this? I mean, this is pretty amazing when you think of this. Look at this. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, meaning whenever government doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. And for you to sign your signature, and throw that on there. That's an amazing thing, and it's one of those things where it took a lot of courage. When we think of that text is literally from the American Declaration of Independence. There are four main purposes of government. Okay, so number one is social order. Chaos ruins societies. And this is one of those things we're going to have to work on throughout the school year to kind of understand anarchy. Anarchy is the absence of government, and anarchy is the belief that people left to themselves will do good, and there is actually no need for any government, zero government. Now, most people realize that chaos is pretty miserable. Nobody wants that, and so then the question becomes, okay, if we need to have government to maintain social order, what's the proper amount of government to maintain social order? And that is where we range in disagreement between low and high amounts of government in order to maintain social order. And that's what all of these things, how much government interference what is the role of the government in all of these areas. Okay, so public services, when you think about it, things like roads and parks and bridges and drainage ditches and providing schools and all these things. These are things that we've just come to expect from our government now. Those things aren't free. We have to pay for them. That's usually through our taxes. National security, obviously, if we're invaded, we need a military to fight off invaders. We're not ruled by somebody else. But then also just the ability to negotiate with other countries, to know what's going on in other countries, to hopefully, not have to get to the point where you actually have to have a war. And then economically, last semester we looked at this in economics, this idea that our government does play a role in helping our economy run more smoothly, providing so that there are more jobs being created, that business is able to move effectively, that our monetary system is secure, that we have faith in the system, that the system can grow and people can live a better life. Okay, so that's chapter 1, section 1.